The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.
The world eagerly bid adieu to 2020, but it's hardly resulted in a quiet start to the new year. Astonishing violence in the U.S. Capitol, new variants of COVID spreading internationally, and unsettled alliances in a multipolar global order. Tonight, we've got a wide-angled look at the geopolitical currents likely to move the world this year. Then, a close-up on Britain as it embarks on its post-European Union future. It's Monday, January 11th, and that's next on the agenda. "2021 is barely a week old, but already it's shown its potential for major international news. Turmoil south of the border in the dying days of a Trump presidency. Global economies stymied by the pandemic, and China and Russia jockeying for position in a shifting world order. And so, as is our annual tradition here, let's find out what to look for in the coming months. Joining us now in Cazenovia in upstate New York, James Steinberg, former Deputy Secretary of State for Hillary Clinton and a Deputy National Security Advisor to President Bill Clinton. He is now a professor of international affairs at Syracuse University. In our nation's capital, Peggy Mason, president of the Rideau Institute and former Canadian ambassador for disarmament to the United Nations. And in the downtown core of our provincial capital, Shuvaloy Majumdar, policy director for former Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird, now Munk Senior Fellow for Foreign Policy at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Great to have you three with us here on what I hope is a Happy New Year for everybody. I want to start with just, let me ask you all to put your newspaper editor hats on, because we want a headline to start out with, and then we'll get into more depth. James Steinberg, start us off. In terms of world trends, give us a big headline for 2020. What's yours?
The catastrophic failure of the international community to respond to the COVID crisis. We've seen both countries, international organizations, leaders around the world really failing to meet a challenge which was predictable and really required significant cooperation across borders, and the results have just been calamitous.
So failure to launch might be your headline. Peggy Mason, what's yours?
Mine is rethinking security, : we need to fundamentally realign our scientific, economic, diplomatic, and political resources to collectively address the health, climate, ecological, and nuclear dangers that threaten us all. So the very short version of that is the pandemic pivot. Essentially, this health crisis has demonstrated the lack of utility of the vast quantities of security spending, defense spending that we have focused on for so long in the name of security.
Shuvaloy Majumdar, your turn.
Global disruption, an age featuring the rise of China and in which the pandemic accelerated new alignments ranging from populism to technology.
Good. Okay, let's follow up on all of those. James Steinberg, how about this? Following up on your headline, why do you suppose the international community has been cooperating so poorly as it relates to tackling COVID-19?
I think the fundamental problem was twofold, which is one, I think that individual states have focused in a very kind of narrow and self-directed way on trying to solve their own problems without recognizing that each of these problems can't be solved by any country acting alone, no matter how powerful, whether it's the United States or China or anybody else. And second, we fail to adapt the international organizations and structures that we have to deal with this world of interconnectedness and globalization. We need new kinds of institutions, new ways of doing business together. And that combination of this inward-directed kind of selfish national thing that we've seen really encapsulated by Trump's America First approach has made it difficult to cooperate, and then we don't have the institutions that can make it possible for countries to come together.
Peggy Mason, I don't want to let governments off the hook here, but governments are elected by their people to respond to the problems within their borders first and foremost. Is it understandable, therefore, that countries would therefore want to take care of the needs of their own population before they think about anybody else?
Well, actually, I would beg to differ a little bit about the international response. I mean, I'm looking at Canada in particular, but I would say that Canada was very active from the outset in supporting the United Nations and the World Health Organization in helping to set up and fund. I mean, we've given 865 million to date to fund mechanisms for helping developing countries to gain equitable access to equipment, tests, treatment, and now vaccines. And we also maintain support for the WHO despite, attacks. Ongoing attacks. So I would say that while the media necessarily focuses in each country on the national response and on problems with supply, at the same time, there has been an extraordinary international effort led by the World Health Organization and the UN Secretary General to rally, to muster efforts to ensure equitable access to treatments and vaccines. So, I would say it's less selfish than perhaps the day-to-day media coverage has suggested.
Shuvaloy, it looks like we have one on each side. You want to break the tie here?
Well, look, I think that international organizations and international cooperation is being clearly disrupted. Nations are acting in their own interests, and the mechanisms for cooperation have completely failed. We don't see collaboration on transportation between countries. We don't see collaboration on vaccine distribution that sees Canada succeeding in this math. 15,000 Canadian dead as a result of ideological commitment by the government to not establish a border early and ensure that people traveling to Canada were less likely to transmit COVID. So I see a very different world than I think Peggy does, because I think that despite best efforts in the international community, they have failed to actually provide not just a pandemic response, but also the kind of vaccine diplomacy that would see how the world can survive the pandemic more fruitfully.
Peggy, you seem to be outnumbered here. I'll give you one more chance to come back and try and convince them if you like.
Well, I don't want to have rose-colored glasses. I mean, it's been a rocky enough road. There's no question. And at the same time, while this international effort has been going on, there's been this counteraction. I mean, in our own country, we have the leading opposition party, the Conservative Party, attacking any effort to cooperate with the World Health Organization. So yes, the lack of full preparedness ahead of time, and just the unpredictability and the difficulty and the scale of response, has really challenged everyone. But I want to emphasize that makes it all the more important that so many countries, without the leadership of the United States, have been working very hard to fund these equitable access mechanisms for developing countries, in spite of all of these problems and challenges and ongoing undermining from opposition parties, from populist sentiments, from nativist sentiments.
Shuvaloy, I do want to come back to you and follow up with this, because I think I saw you say once upon a time that in 2020 we witnessed the state reasserting itself. Tell us what you meant by that.
I think, globalized projects which were which were based on an ideology of nations without borders, of a global community acting together to address common cause. We saw a departure from that type of thesis over the last year or two, principally with states reasserting their borders, whether it's responding to migration crises from the Middle East across Europe to the global pandemic management, and how countries have an obligation to serve their own citizens first, and then cooperate with others of like mind on the basis of cooperation that is trustworthy. And so what we've seen is the concept of the nation state, indelible as it has been since Westphalia, is beginning to reassert itself and provide new opportunities for cooperation in ways that we have yet to imagine on issues that we have never dealt with before. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. I see the rise of populism has good aspects and bad aspects, and a lot of the good aspects of it is a reassertion of the nation state and the international order.
James, do you see it that way too?
Well, I certainly agree with the diagnosis. I think that what we've seen with the onset of the pandemic is that there were two fundamental choices that could be made. Either countries could recognize that the only way to solve this problem effectively was to cooperate together, or the alternative would be to just kind of a beggar thy neighbor approach, which is to try to focus on solving the problems at home and not on how we can work together to do it. And I think, for the large part, the choice was to focus internally and to think that there was a way to solve these transnational problems by acting with a national perspective. Clearly, I agree that states are the core of the response, but unless states recognize that their capacity to deal with problems, and not just pandemic disease, but nuclear proliferation, climate change, the problems of the global economy, really recognize that each country acting alone is simply not going to be able to solve these kinds of problems. And I think now, looking to 2021, the question is, can we step back from this and say, this response that we saw in 2020 is inadequate, it's unsuccessful, it won't work, even if you're worried about protecting the interests of your own national population, that ultimately we've just got to find ways to work better together.
Well, we do need to talk about American leadership for a bit here, because obviously in the past, when the world wanted to solve problems, it often looked to the United States first and foremost to help lead that effort. We are coming to the end of 4 years of, fill in the blank. Use whatever adjective you like, bizarre, erratic, whatever kind of behavior, supposedly from the leader of the free world. So we want to get a better understanding now with Joe Biden and Kamala Harris moving into the White House. Will the United States, in your view, Peggy, start us off, continue to be seen as a less than reliable leadership partner in the world going forward because of the last 4 years?
Well, no, I think is the short answer. I mean, the collective sigh of relief, the international collective sigh of relief at the departure of Trump is going to mean a lot of goodwill for Biden coming in. But of course, the real test will be in his first 100 days in particular. He's pledged to do a lot. And what I'm particularly interested in and taken with is his pledge to elevate diplomacy as the premier tool of American global engagement. And that goes back to my point about security rethink. I mean, how do you build an enduring security? And focusing solely on military responses and on ever burgeoning defense spending has been proven to be in the face of the real challenges, facing the real global challenges, to be, a toothless tiger for all of its cost. So I think Biden, the pragmatist, but Biden really focusing on diplomacy, and hopefully focusing much more on partnership more than leadership. Of course, United States will exercise a leadership role, but really emphasizing working constructively, not just with allies. The imperative to work constructively with China and Russia. That's the foreign. Those are two of the foreign policy challenges that he really faces. But elevating diplomacy is the way to do that.
Well, James, we tend to, I think, look back to the previous administration of the same party to find clues as to how a successor president would govern. So naturally, I think a lot of people are looking to Joe Biden's involvement in the Obama administration to see how he would run foreign policy his own way. Do you think he would do things dramatically differently from the way it was done in the I almost said the O'Biden years, in the Obama years?
I think that what you should really look to is the long history of Joe Biden himself, not just as vice president to President Obama, but his leadership on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, his long and distinguished career as a legislature. And, one of the hallmarks of Biden's time in public office has been his strong commitment to working with other countries. He played a critical role in helping to shape and transform NATO during the critical years after the end of the Cold War. He's played a critical role in reaching out to our friends and partners in East Asia. And so he's somebody who has an enormous amount of experience and respect in working with other countries and understanding the importance of that. And in that sense, I agree with Peggy that I think diplomacy is the natural mode of operation for Joe Biden, both domestically, working across the aisle, but also internationally and working with partners. So I think that will be a hallmark of how he operates. But I also think that this isn't going to be just a back to the future presidency. Things have changed, not only since 2016, but the world is changing in fast ways. And so I think the instinct, this cooperative instinct, the sense of trying to use all of the tools that America has, not just the military, is going to be very, very important. Biden has been very, very cautious and careful about the use of the military all through his career. And so I think that we need to look to how those basic instincts will be adapted to a world that's very different than the one that President Obama inherited in 2008.
Shuvaloy, as much as many people were kind of disgusted with the way President Trump seemed to prefer the company of dictators instead of Democrats, and in particular Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, the way he related to them, it's probably worth putting on the record here that he did have some foreign policy successes. And I invite you, as John Baird's former advisor, to maybe put those on the records for us right now. What did you like about what he did?
Listen, I think separate the odious nature of the individual for just a few minutes, and you'll see a presidency that has seen China for the strategic challenge that it is and mobilize at least the United States and through the power of its own economy, others to acknowledge the reality of that to varying levels of success. The Abraham Accords, I think, in realigning the Middle East to the Red Sea region are an opportunity that the administration has accomplished that I think will have huge consequences. I think since Nixon has gone to China, since 9/11, we have not seen such a significant contribution to the reordering of global relationships, and the normalization of Israeli-Arab relations is a really powerful advent. And third, the language, the lexicon, the opportunity of the Indo-Pacific. Beyond a response to China's belligerence, I think the American administration, acting with a united bipartisan Congress, has seen the Indo-Pacific region as a center of gravity for global growth for the age to come, and is beginning to assemble the kind of security, diplomatic, and economic relationships which I think will advantage the rest of us for a long time to come. So these are all opportunities.
James, as much as it might be a foolhardy mission for me to try to get somebody who worked for Hillary Clinton to say something nice about Donald Trump, would you grant that he's moved the yardsticks forward in the Middle East?
So I don't dispute the fact that seeing this reconciliation between Israel and some of the Arab states is quite important. I don't want to sound churlish, but this was a phenomenon that had been long in process. Most of the Arab states, for better or for worse, are very unfocused on issues like the issues of the Palestinians and very focused on dealing with Iran and the challenges that are represented there. And the alignment, the natural alignment in that respect between Israel and the Gulf states has been long in the making, and it's just been less visible. Similarly, with respect to the Indo-Pacific, I mean, this is an initiative that began with President Obama with the pivot to Asia. It's something that I certainly support and agree with, and I think it is important for the United States to continue to focus on that. But what we see in the Trump administration was a rhetoric about the Indo-Pacific and then a treatment of our friends and allies there that was basically indifferent to their interests, whether it was dealing with Japan or South Korea. We didn't see a president who understood that in order to make the United States successful in the Indo-Pacific, to deal with the challenge of China, that we had to build stronger ties with our allies, not try to bully them or try to achieve short-term, narrow national interests.
Okay, Peggy, start us off here on some discussion about what we might call the Canadian way of relating to the rest of the world. Canadians, have a long history of contributing to international affairs. Having said that, to the extent that we have any influence at all on the world stage right now, and we can discuss how much or how little we actually do have, did our influence grow or recede in this past year?
That's a tough one. I would say that given the role, well, first off, we cannot overstate the importance of Canadian rhetoric in support of multilateralism, the UN, and global solutions to global problems at a time when this was under such attack from the U.S. administration. So that, although I, as a foreign policy person in Canada, have often criticized the government for the gap between its rhetoric and its actions. That support, that rhetorical support for multilateralism has been extremely important. And we followed that up concretely, as I mentioned earlier, with our pandemic diplomacy. And so I would say that and also now it will be understood that one of the more traditional roles that Canada plays is working very hard to support constructive American engagement. For example, constructive American engagement will be seen. The international community will see that we will be playing that role again. So I would say, on balance, over the last year, it has in fact risen, despite our loss at the UN Security Council campaign, which is a whole other issue, which basically had to do with coming in very late and choosing two of the most popular like-minded countries you could imagine to run against.
Well, let me set up this next question to Shuvaloy by saying that normally at this time of year, we have engaged the services of Matthew Fisher, who is, I think, or was at the time, the longest-serving foreign correspondent anywhere in Canada. But he's running for office right now, so it would be unfair to put him in the spotlight right now. Unfair to his competitors, that is. So all that by means of saying, he has an expression which is, there's no country in the world that does less and says more than Canada. And I wonder whether, Shuvaloy, do you agree with his observation?
He's a friend. I'm an admirer. He's one of Canada's great war correspondents. With all due respect to his opponents, I have a lot of time for Matthew Fisher. There is a purpose behind rhetoric. I mean, I always measure rhetoric with the number of times it's repeated, where it's repeated, and how much money is attached to it. And when you see Canadian rhetoric, you can tell that it's principally domestically focused, because it has not resulted materially in any objective influence on any critical issue of 2020. In fact, across the spate of issues that Canadians and our country has had to deal with a disruptive Washington, with the advent of China weaponizing commerce and being opaque about its own participation in the pandemic, we've seen that the rhetoric has been torqued up to domestic audiences and diminished Canada's role globally. And I think that, a real rethink around how Canadians advance the security interests, the economic interests, and our values around the world is absolutely necessary from all quarters of political life. It is absolutely essential in a disrupted world for Canadians to think independently about itself, about its traditional partnerships, and about the new opportunities before us.
James, I don't want the fact that thousands of Canadians are watching this right now to encourage you to ingratiate yourself with them. Give it to us straight. Canada on the world stage, at all relevant? What role do we play, et cetera?
I do think relevant. And on this one, I side a bit more on Peggy's side. I think the voice is important. I can't judge how it plays domestically in Canada, but I think that when Canada speaks, certainly in the United States, I think there are a lot of people who have a lot of respect for that, who see Canada as a country that shares a lot of interest with us. And when it speaks to the need for international cooperation, to strengthen international organizations for that kind of constructive engagement, I think that reinforces those in the United States who share that sentiment. I think it's really critical going forward that Canada, which historically played a large role in U.S. policy focused more towards Europe than the Pacific, play a more active role in this Pacific arena. I think that there are enough trans-Pacific institutions that Canada is involved in, economic, political, security, for Canada to become a voice in creating this new community of the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's a real opportunity for Canada to go forward, to talk about how dealing with the challenges of China, dealing with the problems of transnational issues like nuclear proliferation in North Korea and the like, that we need strong cooperation among like-minded countries. And Canada's voice for doing that, I think, has been important in the past and will be even more important in the future. All
right, let's get to China, since it's been mentioned numerous times. And clearly one of the key questions in the world today is an emboldened China a threat to our way of life? Shuvaloy, start us off on that. What's your view?
I have to reject the idea that China is interested in cooperating with us. And when I say China, I mean principally the Communist Party in charge of it, not the people. What we've seen in China is a project in lifetime rule through President Xi Jinping in which it would see the Middle Kingdom, China, rise and replace the international order of the post-war era. I think that what Beijing sees when it looks around the world is a collection of half hegemonies that feed its own political, military, and economic growth, and that it sees itself in a position to build a new system to rival that of the West. Until Ottawa and other capitals make that decision, and I say this with great concern about Europe as well with their new deal with China, that until Western capitals, democratic capitals, understand that this is a genuine threat to the international system, to the way of life that we've worked so hard to fashion and forge, that until that cooperation, until the understanding of that is accomplished, then the cooperation will be limited. And so I think that China has replaced Russia as the West's principal rival. In many ways, it's turned Russia into a gas station supplying its own energy interests, and that we need to be very lucid and very clear about the threats that China poses to the world order.
Peggy, rival or enemy?
Rival, absolutely. And I think that it's time to really call out this conflation of Chinese internal authoritarianism with external aggression. Its defense strategy disavows defense superiority, hegemony, and in straight defense terms, I mean, China has about 320 nuclear weapons. United States warheads. The United States has around 5,000. United States' defense budget dwarfs China's. It's bigger than the next 10 countries combined, including China. United States has 800 military bases around the world encircling China. China has one foreign base, naval base, tiny naval base in Djibouti. Let's look at the actions. Let's look at the capacity of the country. Let's look at its stated intentions. China has a no first use nuclear policy. And I think that this hyping of the China threat, when China is behaving fundamentally like a great power, serves the interests of the defense lobby, but ill serves a globe where engagement on climate change and on health, to name two, and there has been good cooperation on health in spite of all the hype, are global imperatives. Those are the global imperatives.
Well, okay, let me, I'm going to set up Chuvaloy to come back at you here because I saw him shaking his head in the midst of that answer. But the fact that they're holding two of our people hostage and share very few of our values may have something to do with that. Chuvaloy, you want to come back at what you just heard?
I think that the understanding of threats probably requires a bit of an update. I mean, we've seen China be a belligerent on the Indo-Chinese border. We've seen China be a belligerent in South China Sea. We've seen China use informal fishing vessels to harass the Australians. We've seen China use and weaponize commerce to harass the Australians. Their oppression of the Xinjiang minorities of the Uyghurs, Muslims in their Northwest province. We've seen China not cooperate on health in the World Health Organization. They have only recently in the last week rejected another team trying to find facts around the origins of the pandemic that has ground the world to a halt. We have not seen China cooperate in the UN Security Council or across the spate of multilateral organizations it occupies, whether it's the International Civil Aviation Organization or the World Telecommunications Organization. There's been no evidence at all that China is actually acting as a great power that would be a partner of the West in our shared mutual interests. If anything, we've seen China become a belligerent geopolitical rival at the expense of Canadians like Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, at the expense of 200,000 Canadians who are in Hong Kong. I do not believe that there is any remote equivalence between American power and China's asymmetric power projection. And I think that when we think of Canada's role in it, we're not caught between China and the United States. We are clearly in partnership with the United States and other democracies around the world, and we should make those partnerships more accessible to new partners like India, Japan, and others.
James Steinberg, where are you on China's alleged hegemonic interests?
Well, I don't know if it's hegemonic, but I certainly see it as a great power that doesn't hesitate to coerce others when it can to get its way. And I think that's the most troubling thing about the evolution of Chinese foreign and international policy, is that basically the Chinese have decided that they're going to get their way whenever way they can. And if they can get it through coercion and intimidation, they will do that. And only when they find that they can't get it that way do they tend to turn to trying to cooperate with others. And so I think we do face a China that is very unconstrained in its willingness to throw its weight around, its economic weight, its political weight, its military weight, especially in the Indo-Pacific, to try to get its way. There's no doubt that we have the capacity to deal with that and resist it. And I think if we're clear and resolute in how we deal with China's attempt to throw its weight around, it's possible the Chinese may rethink this. But for the moment, they feel that they've got the upper hand in many cases, and that they're going to use that whenever they can to pursue what they think are their national interests.
We've got so much more to talk about here, and we're running short on time. And I want to ask you about 10 things, and I may have time for one or two. So, all right, let me call an audible here and say, I know this isn't perhaps as topical as Russia right now, but the fact is 10 years ago, the Arab Spring sprung. And as we look a decade later, it looks as if only Tunisia is the country that is really snuggling up to democracy, whereas Syria and Libya are in ruins, and so much of the Arab world has had its heart broken at the loss of potential that they saw it coming. Shuvaloy, why don't you start us off there? Why did the Arab Spring fail so badly?
That's a very complex question, and I draw from some of my experience having worked with Arab Democrats between 2006 and 2010 in the region day to day. What I think has happened is that we've seen with the Arab Spring, the most effective organizations that were able to marshal power, resources, and people were either military and autocratic ones or Islamist ones fueled by regional powers that sought to see the emergence of Muslim Brothers or fundamentalist alternatives. Arab Democrats never had a lot of oxygen to organize, never had a lot of money to be able to put together coalitions that would be competitive. And in the aftermath of the decade that we've seen a region that has been completely afire as a result of a lack of civil society and space for Arab Democrats to succeed and survive. What we are starting to see today, though, is the emergence of countries in the region that are determined to pursue modernity, perhaps through an autocratic model, and countries in the region that are more dedicated to being medieval in their mindset. And that split creates an opportunity for long-term development, long-term partnerships that can see this youth bulge across the region try and find some sort of economic opportunities that would provide them longevity, livelihoods, security, not just in person, but also in food, in health, and a variety of different demands that young people across the region wish. So I think that what we've seen in the hope of the Arab Spring was a decade of total disorder, absolute destruction, horrific levels of death. And maybe there is a silver lining that has been emerging in the last quarter of last year in a way that sees the forces of modernity cooperating better.
Peggy, do you see any silver lining?
Well, I think there is now a much broader recognition of the need for concerted diplomacy to negotiate an end to these, to the ongoing conflicts. I mean, Libya, which was the clearest example of what happens when a strong man is ousted and a vacuum is left, and we see competing armed forces supported by others, by outside actors, states, exacerbating the internal conflict. But in Libya, we now see there's been some progress with the support of important countries towards a negotiated settlement. That's what's got to happen with respect to Syria as well, and that's where United States really engaging in terms of getting all of the actors involved. And if we look at Yemen, one of the the world's greatest humanitarian disaster, and what the Trump administration has just announced, naming one of the parties to the conflict, the Houthis, on the terror list. All of the main organizations, World Food Program, humanitarian organizations, have said this is just going to make finally negotiating an end to that terrible conflict far more difficult. So the silver lining, I think, is that it's become so clear that there is no military solution in these cases, and we have to have a negotiation where all of the parties are at the table, all the internal parties, but also key. There's a negotiation which takes account of the interests of key regional actors, and Afghanistan comes to mind there. It's not just all the internal parties in Afghanistan that have to be at the table. There have the broader interest, India, Pakistan, others in the region, have to be taken into account.
James, on the Arab Spring, how disappointing?
I think that it's encouraging in the sense that it reminds us of this aspiration for human rights, freedom, for expression, for self-determination as a universal one. It transcends borders, it transcends cultures. But I think the focus, as we heard earlier, now needs to focus on the economic side. I think in the long term, the ability to build modern democracies depends on a level of economic prosperity and stability that allows civil society to flourish. And I think that's where we need to focus. And I think that part of the problem with the early expressions of the Arab Spring in 2009, 2010, was the problem that the political movements moved forward, but there was still tremendous lack of economic opportunity, lack of future that went with it, and so didn't create the base that was needed for the long-term success of these projects. So I think we need to focus on how civil society, NGOs, the private sector, and the international community can support economic development opportunities for young women, for across the board, to try to build that base that will allow these freedoms to flourish. Okay,
with a minute left, let me give 20 seconds to each of you to put your reputations on the line, as it were. Let's get some predictions on the record here, which we will play back in a year's time and show how either brilliant or foolhardy all three of you were. Go ahead, Shuvaloy. One major prediction for the year ahead. What do you see?
Continued disruption and continued disorder. I don't think that in 2021 we will see the emergence of a fresh start that we all wished for after 2020. And I think that we can count on this year being as unpredictable as the previous one.
Peggy Mason.
Well, my prediction's in the form of a headline. United States rejoins the Iran nuclear deal, signaling that the dead-end maximum pressure policy of the Trump administration will be replaced by responsible diplomacy as a first step to a rebalancing and a building of a new regional security order in the Middle East, which encompasses both Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Last word to James.
A re-energization of the movement to deal with the problem of climate. I think with the United States rejoining the Paris Agreement and a real concerted effort with some strong leadership from the president and former Senator Kerry, that the United States begins to find new ways to take advantage of the insights we got from COVID and the changing structure of our economy to really begin to get the world back focused on what is the preeminent challenge of our time.
James Steinberg from Syracuse University, Peggy Mason from the Rideau Institute on International Affairs, Shuvaloy Majumdar, Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Really good of all three of you to join us on TVO tonight. The best of the new year, and let's hope all of your optimistic predictions come true.
Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Let this sink in. 1 in 50 people in England has COVID-19. It's even higher if you just look at London, 1 in 30. And while that's dominating daily life there, the new normal of Brexit arrived as Britain announced it had inked a last-minute deal to exit the European Union to avoid the so-called crashing out scenario. With us now for a closer look in London, UK, there's Paul Waldy. He is the Europe correspondent for the Globe and Mail. Paul, Happy New Year. It's great to see you again. I hope you're staying well.
Indeed I am. Thanks for having me on.
Not at all. Well, you and, of course, the rest of the people in the UK have just entered, I gather, your third national lockdown. You're kind of the center of Europe's COVID-19 outbreak. How are people handling all this?
Well, as you mentioned, just at the top there, the numbers here really are quite frightening. You're talking about levels of hospitalization in particular that are much, much higher than we saw back in March when, of course, the outbreak first hit Europe. Not only are the hospitalizations high, but the death toll is climbing. You're seeing numbers like 1,000 a day of people dying. So it's bad and it's getting worse. And really, it's all about this new variant that seems to be spreading far and wide across the country. And the government now is in a desperate race to vaccinate as many people as possible to try and gain some kind of control over this pandemic.
I think I said UK's national lockdown. I meant England, of course. Well, talk to us about this variant, because I guess Britain has the unenviable title of being the locus of this, or the birthplace of this new COVID-19 variant. How did they discover it?
Well, they came across this back in November when the country, and really it is UK-wide, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland also have similar types of lockdowns now. What happened back in November was the country then went into a lockdown, but cases didn't slow down in Kent, which is in southeast England. So they went back and started looking at the work they've been doing on the virus, the sequencing of the genetics of the virus, and they found that there was a different strain of this virus, a different variant of this virus that was showing up in Kent. They traced it back to late September, and it's this variant now that they're saying is up to 70% more contagious. And not only is that a concern, because it has now spread throughout the entire country, and I gather to Canada and other countries as well. There's also a South African variant that has arrived here in the UK that is also highly contagious. So UK right now is getting hit with two variants plus the original COVID that came here in March.
Let's talk vaccines, because the UK government does say that it wants to administer nearly 14 million doses by midway through next month. That's everyone over the age of 70. That would be frontline healthcare workers. That would be social workers who would be at the top of the list. In your judgment, based, I don't know what, on your sense of things, on public opinion polls that have been published, how much faith does the public have in the government's ability to organize the logistics of this?
Well, that's going to remain to be seen. And today, of course, they kicked this off by opening 7 big vaccination centers in some soccer stadiums, some convention centers across the country. So, I mean, there is some hope that this will get delivered. The government now announced today they vaccinated 2.5 million people. That's 1 million more than they announced just about a week or so ago. So they are ramping it up. Whether or not they're going to be able to meet this target that they've set, which is incredibly ambitious, you're talking about 200,000 vaccinations a day. And lately, they've been running at about 300,000 a week. So it is a massive ramp up, but they seem to be doing it. They seem to be getting there. They're now rolling out the vaccine to doctors' offices, to pharmacies, as well as these vaccination centers, and of course, most of the hospitals across the country. So we'll wait and see. I mean, the government does not have a great track record on managing this pandemic so far, but let's hope that they get the vaccination program right.
That's strange that they wouldn't have a great track record on it, because, of course, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, had COVID-19 himself. And I think he ended up on a ventilator for a while as well, did he not?
Oh, yeah. He said he was 50-50. He was in intensive care. This was back in April. So he was very serious condition. But the problem the government's had, and I think in fairness, a lot of governments around the world have faced this, they do kind of a delayed reaction to everything. And, something's happening and the scientists are saying lockdown, lockdown, or do this, do that. And the government delays and dilly-dallies. And Boris Johnson, I guess like a lot of political leaders, is all about optimism and all about the bright side to everything. And he's reluctant to sort of bring forth negative news and tell people they have to stay in their houses. So that's been the government's problem to date so far. It's just been inaction or a delay or just a haphazard approach to this pandemic.
Okay, Paul, let's pivot now to a section we'll call Adieu EU, because it happened. The United Kingdom has now officially left the European Union, and we just want to take a moment here to, I guess, put on the record here some of the changes that are taking place as a result of this deal. No tariffs or quotas on goods. UK able to set its own trade policy and negotiate deals with other countries. The free movement of people between Britain and the EU is over. Brits will now need a visa if they want to stay in the European Union for more than 90 days. The UK will use its own points-based immigration system, where those abroad must prove they meet certain criteria to be allowed to work in Britain. British professional qualifications, we're thinking doctors and engineers, will not automatically be recognized across all EU countries. And of course, the same goes the other way. Northern Ireland, which has always been a tricky issue here, Northern Ireland will still follow many EU rules to avoid the hardening of their border with the Republic of Ireland. But this means there'll be new checks on goods entering Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. Okay, let's get to this. For Boris Johnson, what are the major wins for him in this new arrangement?
Well, you know, the biggest win, Steve, is that he got a deal. I mean, for the longest time, he was saying, we're not going to get a deal. We might not get a deal. There might be a no-deal Brexit. So he set expectations so low that the fact that he got any big relief to a lot of businesses and a lot of people in this country. It also fulfills a long-standing ambition of him and other Brexiteers to get Britain out of the EU. It gives them control over their borders. It eliminates the free movement of people. It lets them control who comes into the country. It gets them away from the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, which has been a big bone of contention for the Brexiteers for a long time, that Britain would not be beholden to a foreign court. So it does fulfill the ambition of Brexit, which was to get Britain out of the EU.
He keeps calling it a jumbo Canada-style agreement. What does he mean when he says that?
Well, what he would like to mean is that this is some kind of comprehensive agreement, much along the lines of what Canada negotiated with the EU, which was groundbreaking on a lot of fronts. It was a trade deal that the EU arranged with Canada, very comprehensive, that they hope to use when they negotiate a deal with the US. The problem is that the UK-EU deal doesn't really come close to the Canada deal on a lot of fronts. And really what it comes down to is a great deal in terms of movement of goods, which is what the EU wanted. It wanted no tariffs, it wanted no quotas, it wanted goods to move back and forth. It doesn't do very much for services, which is what the UK wanted and the EU didn't want, in particular financial services. So, you know, it's not Canada Jumbo or Canada Plus 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 they were heard about for a long time, and that Boris Johnson likes to keep telling us it is.
So if it isn't, why does he keep saying it?
He keeps saying it because that is the example he wants to give, that somehow Britain has managed to create a good trade environment with the EU. He also talks a lot about an Australian-style immigration system, which would be a point system. Yes and no. I mean, again, this is going to be in the details of how this works out, but this is not really the comprehensive deal I think that he had hoped for. He now talks in terms of, yes, there's going to be difficulties. There's going to be further negotiation on a whole lot of different things going forward. So, you know, that's the other thing, that Britain may have left the EU, but it's certainly, the EU is certainly still going to be a part of Britain's life here, because so many things still need to be worked out.
Sure. But of course, they do have a deal. So a deal is a deal, and the Prime Minister is entitled to trumpet that. On the other hand, what are the major losses that the UK is looking at now that they're no longer part of the EU?
Yeah, he certainly does need to highlight the fact that, you know, he got an agreement, and Britain will now be able to go and negotiate deals with other countries. The problem, though, is, again, what this deal doesn't cover, and that is financial services in particular. That's about 80% of the UK economy. London, as we all know, is a big financial capital. And up until Britain left the EU, you could set up shop in London and service clients all across Europe without any restrictions at all. That's gone now. And how that operates going forward is going to be a lot of negotiation, a lot of discussion. And the EU is going to have a lot more say over that, because the EU will decide which financial regulations they're going to abide by or equalize with the UK going forward. So there's a lot to discuss on that, and the EU is going to have a lot more chips on its desk than the UK is. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out.
Well, what are critics saying about an agreement that doesn't cover 80% of the economy? How good can it be?
Well, that is one of the big criticisms of this agreement. Now, a lot of the big financial centers, the big banks and that, have found ways to work around this. But of course, they are waiting to see where these negotiations go forward will end up, because right now the EU is going to get into this debate over equivalence, where they decide which of the UK's financial regulations they're going to follow and they're going to abide by. But the EU has its own priorities. It wants to set up Frankfurt as a financial center. It wants to set up Paris as a financial center. So exactly how much they're going to allow London to dominate everything remains to be seen. They do have a problem in the fact that London is so outsized when it comes to financial services in Europe that really, to make life too difficult on financial services, could hurt their own businesses. So there's going to be a delicate balance here, but that's going to play out for the next several months.
Well, okay, this agreement just got signed, and as the expression goes, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Have you been able to see anything actually change in the short time that this new agreement has been in place?
Well, I tell you what, the one area where you've seen real problems emerging is that Northern Ireland part that you talked about earlier. Northern Ireland, of course, isn't part of the Brexit deal that was arranged between the UK and the EU. It's part of a separate protocol. As you mentioned, it was designed to keep the Irish border open. So to do that, they kept basically Northern Ireland in the EU for all intents and purposes as far as the single market goes and the customs union. Well, what that has done is literally created a border down the Irish Sea. So any goods moving between Great Britain and Northern Ireland are now subject to checks. And what you've seen in the ports in Belfast this week is huge delays. Some trucks are being held up for 12 hours. Trucks don't have the proper documentation. Grocery store shelves literally are empty in parts of Belfast because suppliers in England have just said, well, I'm not going to bother shipping stuff to Northern Ireland because it's too much of a pain, all the paperwork I have to go through. Imagine shipping something from Ontario to Newfoundland and having to go through customs checks. I mean, that's the situation the UK is in. And they're really worried about this in Northern Ireland. The hauliers are worried about it. The farmers are worried about it. If you're a farmer in Northern Ireland and you want to send some sheep to an agricultural show in England, those sheep have to stay there for 6 months before they're allowed back into Northern Ireland. That's going to be unworkable going forward. Now, the government says these are teething pains. We'll figure this all out. But folks in Northern Ireland, grocery stores, truckers, transport people are saying they better work it out pretty quick because it's causing real damage now. And we're only, 2 weeks into this thing.
Well, everybody was saying before this happened that it was a key priority for as many as possible to keep that Northern Irish border as thin as opposed to as thick as possible. Sounds like in the short run, they're having no success with that. Is that right?
Well, even more so, what happened is that Boris Johnson, for the longest time, said, no, there'll be no problem between England and Northern Ireland. We're all in the same country. Trade will move. It'll be fine. That's not what's happening. Trade is being held up. There are difficulties. Again, they say they're going to work this out over the long term, and hopefully they will for the sake of commerce in Northern Ireland, but they haven't yet. Northern Ireland, Irish trade's fine because that border is wide open. On the other side, we should talk about UK-EU. Right now, the Port of Dover has always been the focal point of that trade. 10,000 trucks a day, 20% of everything sold in the UK comes through that port. It's been operating okay. Now, why is that happening? For a couple of reasons. One, a lot of truckers haven't sent stuff over to Calais, over to France, because they don't really know what the system is, so they're waiting to see what it is. On the French side, they've had a light touch so far. They're not checking as much stuff. They're not enforcing the rules as they could. So we're seeing the flow there moving okay. But again, when that starts to ramp up, when we get into sort of a regular seasonal movement of goods, is that going to continue? And is the EU going to be applying quite the same light touch that it has up until now?
Okay. Paul, let me get your sense about how united the United Kingdom actually is, because, of course, we famously remember 52-48, I think, was the vote on Brexit all those years ago. Is the country still essentially half and half on this issue?
Oh, yeah, very much so. There's been minimal movement in terms of polling on Brexit. You might find now it might go 52-48 the other way, but really the population remains as divided. The folks who supported Brexit, back the deal, think everything's going fine. The folks who are against it hate the deal, think everything's going to fall apart. No, the country remains just as divided as ever on this issue. Is
there anything that you could see out there that could potentially change the way people feel about this issue?
It's going to be hard to say because it's one of these things. It's going to be very hard to measure the impact of this deal over time. It'll take 10 years. It'll take a lot of economic digging around to establish what exactly impacted the economy, given the fact that we're in a pandemic, which is going to cause what many believe is going to be the largest recession in the UK in 300 years. It's really hard to know how Brexit figures into that. So I think it's going to be a longer term thing. We might know in the next election when all of these Northern England ridings that Boris Johnson won, if they don't feel they benefited from Brexit, it could be a tougher sell. But we're not going to know that for months, if not many, many years.
And again, following up on how united the United Kingdom is, Scotland is not all that happy about having to be forced out of the European Union because it's part of the United Kingdom. Can you sort of play out the permutations of what's happening on that issue?
Well, this deal has been a huge benefit to Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish National Party. They're heading into elections next year. They're expected to clean up in those elections, win a large majority government. She has been calling for a new referendum on Scottish independence. The polls show she would win that hands down. Now, that's not to say those polls will hold up once a campaign is underway. You recall back in 2014, it went 55-45 against separation. So she does still have a high hill to climb, and also trying to negotiate or trying to sell something that says not only does Scotland want to be independent, but we want to rejoin the EU. That raises a whole bunch of other issues. What do you do with the English border? What do you do with the currency? What do you do with a whole bunch of things? So it isn't a slam dunk for Nicola Sturgeon if she does get a referendum, but things are pointing a lot more in her favor on that front. Boris Johnson is not well liked in Scotland. He's refusing to grant a referendum. It is something Westminster has to approve. He's saying no, that's becoming an issue. Let people decide, give people the right to decide. So right now, things are looking pretty good for a referendum on Scottish independence coming maybe next year.
Well, having said that, I read in your pieces that Nicola Sturgeon so far has been holding to her view, which is there's no point in our calling a referendum if Boris Johnson doesn't give it the good housekeeping seal of approval. Is that still her plan, that she needs Westminster legitimacy before calling it?
She's saying that, and that seems to be the legal framework, that this is a referendum that Westminster has to call. That's what happened last time. There's some people in the SNP who would opt for sort of the Catalan model, where you just go ahead and call a referendum on your own. She's been against that simply because she doesn't think that would work. She doesn't think that would give you the kind of mandate that she would need to sort of form an independent country. So she wants Westminster to call a referendum, and she's now using that as a political weapon, saying we're being denied our right to decide for ourselves because of Westminster. So in a sense, it's feeding into her argument.
Paul, last 30 seconds here. What do you think people are more exhausted by, Brexit or COVID-19?
COVID by far. It has far surpassed Brexit as the big issue here right now. Brexit is pretty much forgotten, if you can believe it. After 5 years of fighting over it, it's been pushed aside by COVID, for sure.
Well, we hope you stay safe, and we're always grateful when you accept our calls and come on to TVO and share your wisdom with us. That's Paul Waldy, the European correspondent for the Globe and Mail. Thanks, Paul, and stay safe.
Thank you. Same to you.
And that is the agenda for Monday, January 11th, 2021. As COVID-positive test counts reach new highs, there's collateral damage to healthcare writ large. Tomorrow, the toll this pandemic is taking on all other needs for medical treatment and procedures. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.